As a way of review, we've talked about objects having properties, methods, and events. And when we're writing code, often we're referring to those properties, methods, and events in our code. So in this top box here, I have some pseudocode demonstrating the way we interact with these methods, properties, and events in a typical object-oriented programming language. It's non-language specific. But we usually have some type of sub-procedure that's handling a specified event or maybe a group of events. So there may be several different events that will cause this sub-procedure to execute. Within that sub-procedure, often referred to as an event procedure because it is handling an event, we're going to manipulate the properties of an object or maybe get the values of properties. We might want to get some data for a property. And we may also call some methods for that object to do something. Now, methods are really a group of code that a programmer or a group of programmers have written and compiled that do something for the object or to the object or with the object. In essence, when we're calling a method, we're sort of taking a detour. We're going out and executing another block of code that we may not even see. That code is executing and then coming back to our project, to our code, and maybe returning a result or having done something. So that's how we work with events, properties, and methods in code. Now, the next box shows an example of what we do in VB. In VB, we have a sub-procedure that is handling some event. And it's handling an event, in this case, for an object. So I have at the end of this line btncalculate.click. btncalculate is the name of our object. The event associated with that object is the click event. When the user clicks on that button, it's going to execute this code. When the user clicks on that button, the code that's going to execute is we're going to create a variable called x, and then for x, we're going to get a property of a text box named txt_1. txt_1 is our object. We're getting the text property or the contents of that text box, and that's a string value. I'm going to convert it using a method of the integer data type called cint. And I know it's a method because it's got parentheses. And txt_1.text is inside those parentheses. It's what we call a parameter or an argument. We're going to take that text value and we're going to convert it to an integer and we're going to multiply it by 2. So in essence, we're going to double the value that's there and then put that in our variable called x. The next line, we're going to modify a property, again the text property of an object, which is a label, LVL output, and we're going to place the value of x in that text property. Now x is an integer and the text property is a string data type, so we're going to call a method of the integer data type called toString. And again, I know it's a method because it's got parentheses. There's no parameter or argument being passed here, but it's going to take that integer value and convert it into a string data type. Same thing happening in my block of code for C#. I don't specify the event within the code itself, so I have private void my procedure, and there'll be some stuff in the parentheses, but you don't see the event listed there like we did in VB. Instead, we are tying the event through the Properties panel, specifically the Events tab of the Properties panel. So you can see there that little screen capture in the bottom right. So I've tied the click event of the button to a procedure called myProcedure. So when the user clicks on that button, it's going to execute this block of code here named myProcedure. So when the user clicks the button, this C# code is going to do the same thing the VB code did. We're going to create a variable called x. We're going to take the text property of our text box named txt_1, and we're going to convert that into an integer using int.parse, which is a method. So txt_1.text is a parameter of that method or an argument of that method. We're going to double it by multiplying it by 2, and then we're going to take that value of x and use the .toString method of our integer variable to convert it to a string before we place it into the text property, which is expecting a string data type. And that text property is the property of our label named LVL output. So let's look at how we might use a property or a method to clear a text box. So I have a form here with two text boxes named txt first name and txt last name, and a button named btn clear. And when the user clicks that button, we want to clear the contents of those two text boxes. And that's what I'm doing in the code here, both for VB and C#. And I'm using two different ways of doing it. They both do the exact same thing, and oftentimes in programming there's more than one way to do something. So in the first line there, I'm taking the text property of our first text box, named txt first name, and I'm setting that property to quote, quote. That is what we call a null string. It's an empty string. And that will clear the contents of that text box. In the second line of our procedure, I'm taking txt last name object, which is a text box, and I'm calling a method that it has called clear. Now when we're using a method, we're actually running some code somewhere else. In this case, this is code another programmer has written. We can't see the code, but we can access it. And that code simply does basically the same thing the first line did, and that is it empties the contents for the text property. Same thing on the C# side. The only difference here between VB and C# in terms of those two lines of code is adding our semicolon.